Hi everyone, and welcome to this live webcast, which looks at maintenance strategies for subsea networks and how to prevent and tackle issues effectively. With so much of the world's data carried over subsea networks, if something goes wrong, whole countries or even continents can be cut off, and it's not always a quick and easy fix. This was illustrated a number of times earlier this year when we saw the cables damaged, cutting off parts of Africa. So this webinar is designed to examine some of the maintenance strategies to ensure that subsea networks remain robust and durable, and it also provides some advice for operators on how to tackle issues effectively if something does go wrong. My name's Keely and I'll be your moderator today, and I'm very delighted to introduce our expert speakers. We have Jeff Bennett, Director of Solutions and Technology from Infinera, our lovely sponsors. Thank you, Infinera. We have a slight change to our lineup. We have Mike Last, Group Chief Marketing Officer at WIOCC, replacing Chris. Thank you, Mike, for standing in. And we have Matthias Fridström, Vice President and Chief Evangelist at Aurelion. Just a few words in terms of format. We'll have a presentation from each of our speakers lasting around 10 to 15 minutes, after which there'll be a short Q&A. If you want to submit your questions as we go along, that's fine. We'll ask them at the end, but don't feel obliged to wait until the end to send them. So, without further ado, let's introduce our first speaker, Jeff. Jeff, over to you. Have we got Jeff?
Sorry, Keely, I was just trying to multitask. I was trying to share and unmute at the same time. It's very undesirable to do that. So hopefully you can see my slide. And so I'll get straight into the topic here, resilience in subsea cable systems. As Keely said, submarine cables are important. There are almost 560 of these cables worldwide. They carry over 99% of intercontinental traffic. If you're ever in an after-dinner conversation with people, satellites do not carry much traffic. They get very high profile, but they carry less than 1% of traffic. And over $10 trillion are carried in financial transactions over subsea cables every day. Now, they're also vulnerable. The International Cable Protection Committee says there are around 150 major cable faults per year. That number goes up because it's proportional to the number of submarine cables there are. So as that number rises, so the number of faults per year will rise. They're typically due to human activity, fishing nets, anchors dragging, but also things like earthquakes. And actually, we saw this around Africa this year. Unfortunately, it's been in the news that February 18th, we had the motor vessel Rubimar struck by a missile that was launched from Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. The vessel dropped its anchor. The crew were evacuated. You wouldn't blame them because I think Rubimar was carrying something like 14,000 tons of fertilizer, which tends to go bang if it catches fire. So they evacuated. But then a few days later, the anchor from Rubimar was dragging and it knocked out a couple of cables. EIG was already out of service from a previous fault earlier in December of last year. And it was shown that the damage was because of that anchor dragging. In March, we also saw an undersea earthquake off the Ivory Coast. And as it turned out, 4 cables were in the trench that suffered a landslide from that earthquake, and they were knocked out. And luckily, there was a new cable system, Equiano, that had recently come online, and traffic was able to reroute predominantly over Equiano. Then I think the latest big incidents have been in May, where trawler activity caused outages on a couple of cables off the east coast of Africa. And that disrupted traffic into Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. So this bad stuff has been happening to cables for a long time. Typically, we try to mitigate those faults by routing cables away from earthquake zones, if possible, away from shipping lanes or fishing grounds, but it's not always possible. You can use armoring on the cable for protection, and that is done in shallow water. But armored cable is really expensive. It's very bulky. It's very heavy. So ideally, you don't use it unless it's absolutely necessary. The deep water cable is only 17 millimeters in diameter. It's just a little bit thicker than a garden hose pipe. So it is very vulnerable, but it's in deep water normally, so it tends to be quite safe. We can also have monitoring of cables for any active response. That's a really interesting area of work. Probably you could do with an entire webinar on that topic. But what can we do if the cable loses service? Well, capacity swaps, backhaul, rerouting, spectrum expansion, these are all things that I'm going to focus on for the rest of my slides today. Let's just think about how resilience happens in a subsea cable versus a terrestrial system. Because in terrestrial, here we see the amplifiers. These are the yellow diamonds, and they operate in a constant gain mode. What that means is that if there's an excursion of power, if you get a variation of optical power in the fiber, the amplifiers will adjust their power levels. So automatic rerouting in the optical domain is possible in these kinds of networks because of that amplifier adaptation. Now, operators may still prefer selective rerouting because, remember, they probably want to sell protected services. So instead of rerouting the entire fiber, you may choose to reroute specific services. Now, in subsea, in a point-to-point connection, well, you don't really have the sort of topological flexibility to do much rerouting. So what happens are capacity swap agreements where one cable will reserve some capacity for traffic from another cable, and it's a quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back type thing. In areas like Southeast Asia, you have a lot of opportunities to create meshed connections in subsea. And in fact, I've been with Infinera for almost 17 years. I dug out this press release from 2015 where we were working with a company that was then called PacNet. They launched an SDN-based automated rerouting system and provisioning system. One of the interesting things is that there are a lot of challenges in subsea rerouting, particularly if you want it to be automated. So what are those challenges? Well, is there actually an available backup route that's not affected by the same fault as has knocked out your cable? Are there spare transponders on that route? Is there spare capacity in the backhaul if you're rerouting across the backhaul? And how do you maintain stable optical power levels during protection and provisioning? Because unlike terrestrial networks, subsea repeaters operate in a constant power mode. So you always have to put about the same amount of optimum optical power into that cable to keep it operating in a stable fashion. So in terms of availability of spare capacity, here's a feature we've offered for over 10 years. It's a CapEx effective way to maintain service-ready capacity in the network. So what does that mean? Well, here's a really simple layout here. You've got sites A and B. These are cable landing stations on the left-hand side here, separated by a stretch of water, goes over to the cable landing station in B, and A and C are connected by a terrestrial backhaul network. So, for example, you can install transponders on that network. Now, operators don't want to just install transponders hoping that customers will give them revenue. And so what we did was to offer a license-based scheme. So you don't have to pay for that capacity unless it's being used. We call it instant bandwidth. So here I've drawn out 12 blocks. That could be 100 gigabits per block. A typical transponder might be operating at, say, 600 gig per wavelength. So we've got two wavelengths combined here to give you that pool of capacity. If you have an unexpected service demand from A to B, you could just add some licenses to your license pool and turn up that capacity. If you have a broken link from A to B and you've got either a capacity swap agreement or it's your network or your cable from between C and B, you can actually just move your licenses. You don't even have to buy new licenses there. You can move them, and when the cable's repaired, you can move them back. So that's a very cost-effective and very, very fast way of doing it. It's within typically within a few minutes. Now, if we look at a region that's causing a few problems, it's the bottleneck through the Red Sea in Egypt. There are 14 subsea cable systems going through Egypt, 10 landing stations, 10 terrestrial routes. And so if you imagine the problem of rerouting through terrestrial backhaul, is there enough capacity there? Presumably those terrestrial backhaul cables will already be busy. So this is where you can use fiber capacity expansion, and it's expanding the spectrum. Basically, we can move from extended C-band to super C-band. We can add L-band, and these are just the sort of the figures for the various bands. The bottom line is that you can end up with a super C and super L system with over 100 terabits per second of capacity on a fiber pair. It's compatible with regular C plus L systems if you need to go over stretches of just C plus L, and also you're not losing optical performance because the way we've designed the amplifiers in a super C super L, it actually has slightly better performance than regular C and L. So one of the things you really need to look for if you're considering spectrum expansion is for it to be hitless. What you don't want to do with a very, very busy fiber pair is to have to move all those services while you upgrade to a C plus L system or a super C, super L system. This example happens to be C plus L. So the L band here, this is actually showing that you don't generate any kind of bit errors that the customer would see. And this was done on a Middle East network link in the backhaul, and the CTO of that particular operator is a big fan of the hitless expansion. He feels that it should be a critical selection criterion for line systems in the future. Now we need to think about optical power levels, and in order to fix the problem, you need to understand where the problem comes from. How is power disrupted in a subsea cable? So if you're putting your transponders into the cable landing station, imagine in a shared spectrum environment where you've got multiple tenants in that fiber pair. The tenant A operator misconfigures some scripts. Because it's a scripted system, that error cascades to all of their transponders. So the whole block of tenant A transponders might disappear. Well, that causes a problem because now you haven't got as much optical power coming from the transponders as the fiber pair needs. Now, you could also think about the fact that it's becoming very common these days to optically express through the cable landing station onto the nearest POP or data center. So you could have the same situation where the tenant A operator misconfigures the transponders, but because you've gone over the terrestrial backhaul, you've got a new failure mode here where a fiber break on the terrestrial side of the network could actually take out a whole block of spectrum that's feeding into the cable landing station. And then the final scenario that I think is interesting is where there's a trend for more branched cables these days. And if you lose the wavelengths that are coming into a branching unit, depending on how that branching unit is designed, you could end up losing optical waves on the main part of the cable as well. So in all these situations, you need to make use of optical power management. And what happens here, if we assume that X is the right amount of optical power that you need in this fiber pair, if you have less than that coming in from service transponders, then you can add optical power from ASE, amplifier spontaneous emission. It's basically an EDFA, or continuous wave idlers, which are a little bit like a transponder without a modulator. So these are power like a dummy level to the fiber pair, and usually fiber pairs are preloaded when they're first deployed. You would preload them with that optical power, and as service transponders come online, you would reduce that ASE or idler power. The line system to make sure that the correct amount of optical power is going into the cable, and of course there are lots of different scenarios where you need to modify the optical power, particularly with provisioning and protection. And so we have software applications that are geared to make those operations easier. In the region, Portugal and Brazil directly, it's a 6,200 kilometer cable system, and it's designed from scratch for data center to data center connection. Glassing through at the cable landing station, going over a terrestrial backhaul. On the Brazilian side of that link.
Hey everyone, we've temporarily lost Jeff. We'll try and get him back. In the meantime, if we hand over now to Mike. Mike, did you want to do your presentation? And we can hopefully come back to Jeff again later as well.
Thank you. Yes, I'll pick up. Let me just share my screen. So actually, Jeff's covered some of the content that I was going to cover, so I will whip through that relatively quickly. I work for an organization called WIOC. We are a digital infrastructure implementer in Africa. So we build infrastructure that underpins the networks of hyperscalers, carriers, internet service providers by investing in subsea and terrestrial backhaul. And over the last couple of years, we've started a data center business. We also offer managed services across Africa. So we've got a portfolio of services very much aimed at the wholesale industry. And it makes us quite different to other players in the market. We don't serve the corporate community. We don't have consumer business. Our focus is very much on wholesale. And a lot of that is around infrastructure, subsea, terrestrial data centers. I'll talk a little bit about WIOC's involvement in the recent outages in Africa. As Jeff highlighted, there have been a number of cable cuts this year that have caused major disruptions to the internet in Africa. I won't go through them in detail. He's already done that. But earlier this year, the cuts on the West Coast took out every submarine cable system serving Africa, leaving only one connection on the West Coast between Southern Africa and Europe, which is where a lot of people want to connect to. This was exacerbated by the fact that on the East Coast at the same time, we had the outage that Jeff talked about previously, which was a series of cable cuts in the Red Sea that disrupted a number of the cables serving the East Coast of Africa. So at this time, we really only had two cables serving Southern Africa, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. Going back to that West Coast incident, with so many cables down, there was a huge impact on the internet in Africa. Some countries went completely dark. Generally, operators invest in diversity in their networks, particularly terrestrially, but also internationally, meaning that they buy capacity on multiple cables, sometimes from multiple suppliers. Sometimes they'll buy effectively resilient services from single suppliers. And then they split their traffic across two cables, or three cables, or four cables, depending on how much diversity they've invested in. With the outages that took place in Africa earlier this year, some countries actually went dark. Some operators went dark because all of the international capacity that they were trying to route to Europe was on cables that were down. What happens in those circumstances? WIOC, as I said, is a carrier's carrier. We're very much set up to serve carriers and internet service providers. We invest strategically, and one of our investments recently is in the Equiano cable, which is the cable that Google instigated down the west coast of Africa. So we had capacity on the Equiano cable, The challenge, however, is that generally when people own capacity in subsea cables as owners, they don't light all that capacity on day one. Optical technology moves on very, very quickly, and the costs of lighting capacity and the ability to expand that capacity tend to increase over time. So if you put all your investment in on day one, light all your capacity on day one, and have a lot of it sitting there empty for a long period of time, it's not the most cost-effective way to run that capacity. So typically, people turn up capacity that they think they're going to need for the next year to 18 months. And as they start to see that being overutilized, well, not overutilized, but used up, they then turn up more capacity. So when we activated our fiber pair on Equiano, we turned up a relatively small amount of capacity. Suddenly, with the whole of the West Coast suffering these outages, lots of operators came to us looking for restoration solutions on Equiano. Now, in typical circumstances, that would take many days, typically actually weeks, to be able to turn up capacity that's not already lit. You need to be able to source optical equipment. That often needs to be flown in by suppliers. In some cases, it actually needs to be manufactured by suppliers before it can be flown in. It needs to get through customs and immigration, which can be a challenge. For us, we were able to turn up 2.5 terabits of capacity on our Equiano fiber pair very, very quickly. Part of that was due to our relationships with partners, suppliers, and even our clients. So in some cases, we were actually able to borrow equipment that was already in country from some of our clients and customers in order to be able to turn up capacity on the system. We very, very quickly in those circumstances turned up over 100 individual circuits. We restored 13 of the leading players in Africa's wholesale internet ecosystem. And we were able to do that such that internet services were restored very, very quickly by some of the major operators in Africa, some of the smaller operators, and the global cloud operators, many of whom also run their Africa services across our network. Without that capability, the internet would have been down for a lot longer. That's a little bit about kind of the background. What can operators do? What can carriers and internet service providers do to effectively ensure themselves against this? One way is to invest in more resilience, to buy capacity on more systems. And we've certainly seen with the Equiano cable going live a great deal of interest in taking capacity on that new cable system to add resilience to carriers' networks. And that resilience isn't just the fact that it's another cable system. The new cable systems that are being deployed in Africa at the moment are typically landing at new points on the African seaboard. So you no longer have single points of failure at a limited number of cable landing stations. More and more cable landing stations are being deployed. The new cables are also being landed into open access data centers. And this is making access to those cables much more fair and equitable and much more cost effective. Historically, cable landing stations were a point at which the owners of the cable landing stations could charge people for connecting to the cable. By terminating the new cables in open access data centers, a lot of those costs and a lot of that complexity has been eliminated. So we're seeing with these new cables, not only new subsea routes, but also increasing accessibility and more resilience in terms of cable landing points. And it's interesting, if you look back 3-4 years in Africa, there was a sense that it was going to be difficult to put together a business case for any new cables. There were already large numbers of cables in Africa. And it's only when you see the impact of outages like this that you realize that actually there remains a business case. What we've seen over the last few years is the global cloud operators moving a lot of their content to Africa. And again, that's another potential strategy for operators to peer with content in Africa, in the data centers where hyperscalers and other content owners are locating their content increasingly. And that then reduces dependence for a period of time on these international connections. I think that's where I wanted to finish for now. I'm very happy to take questions when we get to the Q&A session. But I'll pass back to see if we've refound Jeff or whether we want to pick up on the following presentation.
Thanks, Mike. We have indeed refound Jeff, but he assures me that he was towards the end of his presentation, so we can pick back up at the Q&A with Jeff. Thanks ever so much for your presentation, by the way. That was great. Thank you for talking us through all your work in Africa and everything that you guys are doing. So let's move on now to Matthias. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen. I hope you see the screen now. So now we're going to go into a sort of a much smaller region than Mike talked about. Mike talked about sort of the entire African continent. I'm going to talk much more about the Baltic Sea and what's going on up here. This can obviously be applicable to many other regions. So, you know, what I say here is probably applicable to many other things. Just to start off with, you know, in the autumn of 2022, we were in a Swedish magazine called The Most Important Company You've Never Heard About. And then the funny thing was, or not so funny thing was, that the next autumn, 2023, we had this cable in the Baltic Sea that was under what's in the media called the sabotage. Yeah, it's not 100% clear what happened, but we believe that someone damaged the cable on purpose. So we went from the most sort of unheard company to the most heard company in a very short period of time. And I think that's sort of what underpins this discussion I will have here. For those of you that doesn't really know Aurelian, we used to be called Telia Carrier. We were part of the Telia Group. We were sold. We're now on our own. And we have a global network. So we run a global network of submarine cables around the world. Some of them we lease, some of them we own. And I'm going to focus much more on the Baltics today. And just for your understanding, you know, about 50% of our footprint in terms of traffic goes to the internet backbone that we run. We're the largest internet backbone in the world. And about 50% of our traffic goes to waves and Ethernet and other services sold to customers. So that's sort of the background of ourselves and what we do in our company. So basically, around the Baltics, the way the Baltic looks today is that there is a number of submarine cables between obviously Sweden, because Sweden is the sort of center of the Baltics, and then Finland and the Baltic countries around. Some of the cables we own, some of the cables are owned by others, and the combination of all of this is what makes up submarine cables in the Baltics. Most of the cables in the Baltics are actually fairly old. They were built towards the end of the 90s. There's been some new cables being built later on, but very, very few. But we've also seen that the characteristics of all cables being built in the 90s are still extremely good. We have recently updated using another fiber pair in one of these cables, and we could absolutely use the latest and greatest gear that worked perfect. So I would say most cables here, despite being quite old, are in really good shape. We should also remember that there is very little fishing activities in the Baltics, unfortunately. So therefore, the biggest and the scariest thing
Matthias,
for cables...
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Could you put your slides in presenter mode? They don't seem to be moving.
Okay. It is in presenter mode, but I'll... Yeah.
I think you may need to share a different screen, Matthias.
Yeah, I'll probably share a different screen then. Do you see it better now?
It might just be a delay. We just see you at the moment.
Okay, sorry. Weird. Is this better?
Something's coming through. No, that's a message. That's an Outlook message.
Do you see it now?
No. What I'm seeing is a reminder for a meeting. I think it's an Outlook window that you're sharing.
I changed to share. Okay, sorry. I share the window again. Do you see now?
I see the PowerPoint. I think it's in edit mode. I don't think it's presenter.
Is it better now? Now it's presenter mode on my side.
Right. You're probably dual screen, are you?
No, I only have one screen here.
Oh, no, that's interesting. No, I'm just seeing a presenter mode. It says, I can see a slide that says the Nordics and the Baltics.
Yeah, that's the slide I showed. Do you see the next slide now?
No. No, it's still on the Nordics and the Baltics.
Mm-hmm. Very strange. Sorry for this. How can I change them? I can either change. I'll change.
I mean, what you could do, I guess, as a sort of second option would be just have PowerPoint in the edit mode and click to the next slides in PowerPoint. You might get your animations and things.
If I do it like this again.
It's an Outlook. I'm getting an Outlook message reminder. Yeah. It's just you now.
Do you see it now?
No, it's just you now. It's just your video. One sec. No, still you at the moment. See Keely now.
Sorry. Really weird. It worked perfect before. Do you see now?
Yes.
No, you're back. Well, it's PowerPoint, but it's in edit mode. So what you could do is just click to next slides there.
Yeah. Would you be able to do that for us? Perfect.
Yeah,
thank you.
Better? So you see the Nordics and the Baltics on the slide now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, let's do it like this. When I press presenter mode, then it appears to be gone. So I'll stick to this then. Okay, sorry. All right. So what we have seen in the Baltics is obviously a change to the geopolitical situation. We have a war in Russia, obviously very close to where we live. And we also had this sabotage to a number of cables in the Baltics, and therefore a lot of more companies are now much more looking into this and are sticking up and saying, hey, are there ways of sort of spreading our traffic more wide around the area here, and is there anything you can do? So, and we also see a lot more activities around here. So what's going on is that suddenly there is a big interest in actually reusing older sea cables that has been taken out of service since years. They're still in the water, they're still functioning, they've been claimed very old, and of course they only have 4 to 6 fiber pairs, so they've not really been sort of seen as the future here, but suddenly we have now investigated about reusing some of them. There was an old sea cable further up in the Baltics that now suddenly becomes one of the more important cables. And even the long distance around sort of Sweden, Finland on land has becoming very interesting from a lot of people. So I would say this has been a very interesting thing happening in the Baltics, where we previously talked about, we need new cables and only new cables. Now suddenly every old cable is of interest here due to the political situation and everything that goes around here. So what's going on right now is that there is a big increase and big interest from everyone, customers and everything around how can we produce more diversity. Even if we can put an older system into an older cable, that's still important because, there's a lot of customers, mainly on the enterprise side, that is prepared to pay quite a lot of money to have not only one route or 2 routes or 3 routes, they even want 4 routes here. So something is really going on here. And of course, we've also seen an increased interest in governments, authorities funding these cables and so on. So I would say what's going on right now is actually pretty interesting and something we haven't seen before in the Baltic. It's always been talks about something else. So just to sort of build on this one, Jeff mentioned in the beginning what happens when these cables are out. I can just explain to you what happened when our cable went out during the autumn when we had this sort of what's in media called the sabotage. We had an outage in the middle of the sea between Stockholm and Tallinn. That's the cable that went down. So we could see that all the IP customers we had who were on the internet backbone, they were all rerouted. The traffic found new routes within milliseconds. So none of them even discovered that something happened here. So from an IP perspective or an internet perspective, nothing really happened here. We had some Ethernet customers who had services that we could reroute again within milliseconds. So they didn't even notice this themselves either. So from that point of view, those customers were fine as well. They were happy going forward. We did have some wavelength customers, and normally when we have wavelength customers buying waves from us, they buy them unprotected. They buy them as single links, and they know that when they're down, they're down. And people also know that submarine cables will be down for days. In the Baltics, it could be up to a week. It's not weeks and months like it is in other seas, but it could be weeks here. They know this. They buy their own protection in most cases. So obviously, we had a few of them calling us saying, is there any way you can help us get this traffic up? We managed to reroute some of them, but also we told some of them, that's not the service you've bought. You are down, and that's the way it works. And then, of course, we have sold a few fiber pairs. Those customers know themselves that when a fiber is down, it's down, but they, of course, take care of their protection. So basically, we can see here that, most of our customers didn't really see this outage, but some did, and some we could help. Some didn't want to have help because they've helped themselves. So I think that's what's going in here. So as a conclusion here, I think the awareness of what can happen has really increased among governments, authorities, and everyone, and all due to this crazy outage that sort of ended up in the media where everyone discussed why did this happen and who took out the cable and why did they take out the cable and do we have that many cables and wow. So the geopolitical situation has really caused some disturbance up in the Baltics, and of course we are much more on alert these days, making sure that our cables are as protected as they can. And customers have come to us and said, how can we triple the protection, quadruple the protection? Is there anything more we can do? So the impact, as I said, we didn't really have that much of an impact with one cable going down, but of course, when two cables goes down, then it starts to be seen and shown and felt. And if three cables at the same time would go down, I would say we would have it would be difficult for us to save all traffic everywhere. So that's sort of something we have to think about, how do we protect ourselves from more cables going down? And I think when we look at the future plans, I think we simply need more cables. Even if they're old, they will still be relevant and they will still provide protection we don't really have today. Everyone before talked about, we need the lowest latency, the shortest cable. I think that's almost out. Round trip delay is always important, but I think diversity is even more important. And if one cable is twice as long as the other, no problem. We still need that traffic. And then, of course, there will be new cables built. We will have easier ways of getting funding. And that's also what's going to happen in the Baltics. I would say things will change up here in the Baltics. Things have really changed with the outages we've had. Obviously, people up here read about the Red Sea, they read about the West Africa outages, and everyone talks sea cables these days. I don't think I've talked to any government before about this. Now I've done that not on a weekly basis, but on a monthly basis at least. So I think some of the outages we have seen the last year have really caused the world to wake up, and now we need to work on the protection to be much better here. So sorry for the slide madness, but I think that's what I wanted to say here. So thanks.
Thank you, Matthias. No problem. We got there in the end. So thank you everybody for your presentations. This brings us to the Q&A part of the webcast. I've got a question for for all of you. Is it a myth that wet plant cables are vulnerable to undersea eavesdropping? I'm going to go to Jeff first for this one.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, so in the past, old-fashioned telegraph and telephone cables perhaps could have been intercepted and so on. Think about the practicalities of doing that with a modern repeated fiber optic cable. For a start, you've got 15,000 volts running through that cable, driving the amplifier chain. So anyone trying to get to the fiber compartment in the center of the cable has to go through that conductor. That's a brave person that does that, I think. And even if you manage to tap into the fibers, what happens then is you immediately get post-FEC bit errors in the transponders because you would have interrupted and reduced the signal. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I would think it's very, very difficult. I don't know if either of the other presenters have got more detailed thoughts on it.
No, I can just echo that, because we get that question from authorities all the time. You know, how do you guarantee that no one is sort of eavesdropping on the traffic? And I think what Jeff said is super clear. It will be noticed. Obviously, there are, during an outage, you can probably break the cable at some other places, so it's not absolutely impossible, but I find it close to impossible to do this. And yeah, I think what Jeff said is very relevant. It would be dangerous.
Yeah. There seems to be very little in the literature suggesting that it's possible as well. You know, often with these things, it's out there that studies have shown, but doesn't seem to be the case with this. So yeah, I think, you know, with subsea cables, the bigger risk is when they come to land. They're much more accessible terrestrially than they are on the bottom of the ocean.
Great, thank you. And Matthias, you were talking about almost there being more cables to, you know, kind of for almost backup, if you like. I've got kind of a question for all of you. Have you noticed any kind of trends in terms of where the investment is, where people are wanting the cables in terms of geographically? Have you noticed anything change in recent years as to where people are looking for cables to be built or where particular investment is?
No, yeah, I can start with that one. And I think really what people really want is more geographical diversity. I think if you look at the trend between Europe and US, you know, it was always the same route before. But what we see now is every new cable finds a very unique new route. And that's all down to diversity, because, you know, we'd like to spread our traffic between Europe and US in as many cables as possible, but also very geographically diverse. So I would say routes you never thought would be applicable is suddenly applicable. And that's all due to diversity reasons. And yeah, obviously there is more traffic between certain destinations, and you need to be fairly close to those destinations. It wouldn't make any sense to take traffic from Norway via Madrid over to US. But of course, this geographical diversity is very interesting. And we also get a lot of questions from customers where they want to see the map of how their traffic is transported. And if we can show that it's clearly diverse between route A, B, and C, then that's, so I would say the trend is to have that more and more. And that's what we see up here in the Baltics as well, that people are, you know, yeah, even if the traffic is going to be between Stockholm and Helsinki, they would like to see one route over Lithuania, one route over Estonia, one route another way. So I think that sort of geographical diversity is something that's coming up more and more when we sell our services.
I think what we've seen in Africa in recent years is sort of filler cables. So filling in, again, to give further diversity to places that may already have one or two cable connections. So the Indian Ocean Islands is a good example of that. Places like Mauritius, Réunion, Mayotte, the Comores, and so on are all investing in more cables to connect them to Africa. You're seeing coastal cables that are filling in some of the gaps in the international cables. So I think that's been the drive. But then we've recently seen a big announcement from Google that they're going to connect South Africa to Australia. So there's still huge intercontinental deployments being planned as well.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
I'd echo that, because you know,
Go, Jeff, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, the long distance cables they take years to plan, of course. There's a bottleneck in terms of permitting. A lot of people complain how long it takes for permitting of these cables. Don't know if some folks on the webinar would remember there was a headline the other day about Vietnam streamlining its permitting process, probably trying to become as Matthias says, you know, you're looking for diversity. You look across the Asia Pacific region, a lot of countries in that region are actually on the sort of ring of fire geological faults. So diversity of routing becomes even more important in that region. And Vietnam could easily set itself up as a diverse landing location in the region. You've got the geopolitical issues of cables not being allowed to land in China if they carry US traffic. It's an increasingly complex situation. But in the background, you've got ongoing increases in demand, and I think artificial intelligence is we haven't yet seen the real evidence of AI starting to drive data center demand. I reckon it's like any day now we're going to start to get confirmation about that, because we know it causes a huge increase in processing power. Does it produce an increase in network traffic? We'll see. But I've got a suspicion it will.
That's interesting. There's been a lot said, hasn't there, about AI in you know, all optical networks, really. So it'd be interesting to see how it would affect, you know, kind of the subsea realm, as it were. Before we close, we had quite a few people ask if it would be possible to access your slide decks, everybody. Are you happy for us to share those after the event so that everyone can have a look at them? Because I think everyone was quite interested in what you were all saying.
Yep, no problem for me. Yep.
Perfect. So everybody, the slides will be available after the webcast, which will also be available on demand. So thanks, guys, for that. That's brilliant. And thanks for joining us today. So that brings us to the end of today's webcast. As I say, it will be available on demand for the next 12 months on the Fiber Systems website. As a reminder, that's www.fiber-systems.com. But obviously the live Q&A won't be available on Catch Up. So please, can I thank very much Jeff, Mike and Matthias. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Infinera, the Europa Science production team working in the background as always, and to everyone out there who's taken the time to watch the webcast. Thanks, everyone. Bye.